Now, before we jump into what is the world then, let's review the mainstream worldview of our culture, materialism or physicalism. I'll keep on using the word materialism. First, let's understand what it is in philosophical terms, strictly. Let's understand what it is, what it means, what the implications are. Materialism is the view that the world out there, beyond our minds, is not mental. Whatever it is not mentation. It is of a completely different kind of stuff than thoughts and emotions are made of, than dreams are made of. And that abstract stuff that is supposed to constitute the world around us, under materialism, can be exhaustively describable through a list of numbers. In other words, if you provide a complete enough list of numbers, you will have said everything there is to be said about the world. Nothing will be missing. Now, notice that this is not as intuitive as it may sound at first, because the world we see around us is a world of qualities, not quantities. It's a world of reds, blues, and greens. It's a world of sweetness and saltiness. It's a world of melodies, of textures. It's not a world of kilograms, of hertz, of frequency, amplitude, mass, charge, and momentum. But materialism would say that this is what the actual world is made of. It's a purely abstract world made of, well, quantities. And it has no intrinsic qualities whatsoever. It is not something you can visualize, because the moment you visualize, you're already bringing qualities into the picture. The world of materialism, the best you can do to visualize it is a world that is made of equations floating in a vacuum. And qualities under materialism are supposed to be generated by our brain inside our skull. The redness of an apple only exists inside your skull because it's made by your brain. The sweetness of a strawberry only exists inside your skull because it's made by your brain. The bitterness of disappointment exists only inside your skull. The shiny silvery color of the moon at night only exists inside your skull. The inner surface of your actual skull is beyond the qualitative moon you see on the night sky under materialism. Now, why is this wrong and demonstrably wrong? There are a number of reasons. Let's start from the logical reasons why this is wrong. Materialism is internally contradictory. And the reason is the following. It defines matter in a way that makes it incommensurable with mind, and then tries to explain mind in terms of matter. It cannot work. Materialism defines matter as purely quantitative, and then tries to explain the qualities of experience in terms of those quantities. And that makes no sense. It's an internal contradiction. Another reason it's contradictory is that we never are directly acquainted with purely quantitative matter. All we have are qualities. The textures of the objects I touch, the solidity of a rock, if I kick it, these are qualities of experience. The blueness of the sky is a quality of experience. We never come in contact, in direct contact, with purely quantitative matter. Therefore, matter under materialism is a theoretical abstraction. It is not a fact of experience. It's not an empirical given. It is a theoretical abstraction, a theoretical entity that may or may not exist. But either way, it is, insofar as we can know, a theoretical abstraction. Now, who makes the theoretical abstraction? Well, the minds of materialists. This abstraction of purely quantitative matter is a product of a mind. And it exists, as far as we know, only in the mind that creates it. And once it has created it, that same mind tries to reduce itself to it, tries to explain itself in terms of its own abstraction. Now, here's a metaphor for you to understand what I'm trying to get across. Imagine you're a painter and you paint a self-portrait. You paint a representation of yourself on canvas. And having done that, our painter will then point at the portrait and say, I am that. I am the portrait I just painted. Well, but what about the painter then? Well, our painter would say that he can explain himself in terms of the patterns of pigment distribution on canvas, the portrait he has just painted. Can that work? Of course not. This is like a dog chasing its own tail. It cannot work. So that's the second reason materialism doesn't work. There is a third, also a logical reason. Materialism replaces the territory with the map. When quantities arose in the early days of science, they were used as descriptions of a qualitative world, descriptions of our experience of the world. So if I would tell you, your piece of luggage weighs 50 kilos, you would know what to expect to experience if you tried to lift your 50 kilos piece of luggage as opposed to a piece of luggage that weighs only 5 kilos. So the 50 and the 5, these numbers are descriptions of experiences of the world we experience. That's how quantities came into the picture. That's how kilometers, kilograms, hertz, they came into the picture. Quantities were descriptions of the world, descriptions of experience. In other words, quantities are the map, a description of the territory. But at some point in the 19th century, something very weird took place. Certain people, very influential in the intellectual elites of the world, started putting forward that the quantities, the descriptions, precede the thing described, that the map precedes the territory, and that we must explain the territory in terms of the map. In other words, we need to take the map, reach into it, and pull the territory out of it. Now, obviously, that doesn't work, and today we give it a name. We call it the hard problem of consciousness. And we promise ourselves that although we don't have a solution to this problem, in new future versions of the map, we will be able to reach into it and pull the territory out of it. Now, that is ludicrous. That is just silly because it arises from an obviously faulty line of thinking. We are not to replace the territory with the map. Quantities are descriptions of the thing in itself, not the thing in itself. And that's another reason why materialism can never work. It replaces the territory with the map and tries to pull the territory out of the map, which will never work, not even in version 3.0 or 1,000,000.0 of the map. There are also empirical reasons why materialism is demonstrably false. In foundations of physics today, we know that the fundamental physical entities that seem to constitute the world, in other words, elementary subatomic particles like electrons, quarks, muons, and so on. We know that these elementary building blocks of the physical world do not have standalone existence, do not have standalone reality. They only come into existence upon measurement. You have to measure the world to get subatomic particles. Before you measure the world, you cannot say that there are subatomic particles to be measured. Now, how do we know this? We know this from a series of experiments that has now been going on for over 40 years. And what we do, we produce two elementary subatomic particles together, so they are entangled, and we shoot one in one direction and we shoot the other in the other direction at almost the speed of light. Let's call them particles A and B. And then, say, scientist Alice, after a while, performs a measurement on particle A, and on the other side of the universe, but at the same time, scientist Bob makes a measurement on particle B. It turns out that what Bob sees when he measures particle B depends on what Alice chooses to measure about particle A. In other words, we cannot say that what Bob sees was a particle that already existed prior to Alice making the choice of what to measure. Instead, the conclusion, which is now unavoidable short of some theoretical fantasies, the conclusion is that particles A and B do not exist prior to measurement. They exist only upon a measurement on the world. So the world itself cannot be constituted of particles, because the thing you measure is not a particle. Particle arises from measurement. Now, the two theoretical fantasies that could avoid this conclusion are, one of them is the notion that there are countless physical universes popping into existence every infinitesimal fraction of a second, for which we have absolutely zero empirical evidence. This is a fantasy, and it's one of the most implausible fantasies conceivable to human thought. The other fantasy is that there are so-called hidden variables about the world that orchestrate these correlations between the measurements of Alice and Bob. But we don't even have a hypothesis about what those hidden variables might be, not even a theoretical hypothesis, and certainly not an iota of empirical evidence for them. So they too are pure fantasy. So short of these woo fantasies, we are left with the conclusion that the world prior to measurement or observation is not physical. The thing that we measure is not physical. Physical is the result of measurement. Now, how can we make sense of this? Well, it's very, very simple. Let's go back to the airplane metaphor and the dashboard. The dashboard only displays something if the airplane's sensors measure the world outside, measure air speed, measure air humidity. And then those measurements are displayed on the dials of the dashboard. If nothing is measured, the dials show nothing. And is this surprising? It's not surprising at all. It only means that the world out there is not physical. Physicality is a representation that arises from measuring the world. It's an indication on the dials of the dashboard. That's all it means. And the correlations between what Alice chooses to measure and what Bob sees when he makes his measurement are also very easily explainable in the same terms. I will use another metaphor. Suppose you are a soccer fan and there will be an important soccer game and you want to watch it from home, and you are such a fan that you buy 2 television sets and you watch the same soccer game on both television sets, each TV tuned to a different broadcaster. And suppose that each broadcaster has their own set of cameras in the stadium. So you see 2 different images on the 2 television sets, but 2 different images of the same game. Therefore, what happens on one image correlates perfectly with what happens on the other image, without the TVs having to communicate with one another. Now imagine that you have a friend who is a time traveler and he just came to visit you from the 19th century to watch the soccer match with you in the 21st century. He sees that the images on the little man on the 2 televisions, their behavior is completely correlated with one another. If the little man on the TV on the right runs up, the little man on the TV on the left runs down, or something like this. And he is flabbergasted with this, because the little men are not communicating with one another across the TVs. How can that be? How can what happens on one side be so perfectly correlated with what happens on the other side? How do the little men know where to run? So to synchronize their behavior. Well, our time traveler is surprised because he thinks that the images on the TV are the game, that the images are the thing in itself. So if there are real little men running on the left and real little men running on the right, then it's a miracle that they can coordinate their movements without communicating with one another. Just as it seems to be a miracle that what Bob sees correlates perfectly with what Alice chooses to see, chooses to measure. Now, of course, the fallacy here is to think of the images on the television as the game. The images are not the game. The images are representations of the game. The thing in itself is what's happening in the stadium, not what's happening inside the TVs. So if we understand that the world as it is in itself is not physical, many of the fantastical, troublesome implications of quantum mechanics become very intuitive. We just have to look at 21st century evidence with a 21st century mind. But under materialism, we look at 21st century evidence with a 19th century mind, and that's not going to work. Now, finally, there is one more empirical reason why materialism is wrong. And that comes from the neuroscience of consciousness and psychiatry. Under materialism, experience is brain activity, or is generated by brain activity. So there cannot be anything about the information content of experience that is not directly grounded in the dynamics of brain physiology. One is the other, so to say. And most of the times, this seems to work. Most of the times, more experience correlates with more brain activity. It's needless to say. There's lots of neuroimaging studies showing that ordinarily speaking, more experience, by more experience I mean more varied or intenser experience, correlates with more brain metabolism, more brain activity. However, there is a set of circumstances in which precisely the opposite happens. And this set is very reliable. It's the black swan. And if your theory is that all swans are white, that all experience is produced by brain activity, then one black swan is enough to break your theory and refute your theory. We know today, for instance, that psychedelics, all psychedelics that we have studied so far, work by significantly reducing brain activity and not increasing brain activity anywhere. Yet a psychedelic trip is known to be one of the top 3 most significant experiences in someone's life. And that's research by Johns Hopkins. While you're having the intensest and richest experience of your life, your brain is effectively going to sleep. As a matter of fact, it's not even that, because the sleeping brain, dreaming, has quite some activity. And under psychedelics, there is a significant reduction in activity. And it's not only psychedelics. If you reduce blood flow to the brain or brain oxygenation by partial strangulation or by G-force-induced loss of consciousness, people report trip-like experiences, dream-like experiences, very rich, very intense. Pilots that undergo G-force-induced loss of consciousness in a centrifuge during training, they report, quote, memorable dreams. Even people who suffer bullet wounds to the head trauma, or the progression of dementia, have been known to manifest what is called acquired savant syndrome. They suddenly become geniuses in certain areas of human activity, like music composition, or memory, prodigious memory, or mathematical calculations that are done as fast as a computer. And if you ask them how do they do that, they say, I don't know, this stuff just comes to me. And that follows severe brain trauma, lightning strikes to the head, bullet wounds, traffic accidents with major head trauma, even the progression of dementia, as I said. There has been neuroimaging studies, for instance, of so-called mediums that write text down that they claim doesn't come from themselves. Now, I reserve judgment about this mediumship stuff. But the research is very objective and very well controlled. It has been shown that for controls, if you ask a control group of people to write down complex text, brain activity in key brain areas associated with cognition will increase significantly under a brain scanner, an fMRI. But if mediums do that, brain activity significantly decreases in respect to the default brain activity baseline. And then people still have scored the respective texts according to a measure of complexity, which can be done very objectively through a computer program that analyzes the syntactical, grammatical, and semantical complexity of the text. And the text produced by the mediums scores higher in complexity than the text produced by the controls. And so this is not only psychedelics, it's not only the choking game, it's not only acceleration-induced loss of consciousness. It's not only mediumship, it's a whole host of activities that correlate with a reduction or an impairment of normal brain activity, which lead to higher cognitive skill, intenser, richer experience. And that's a whole group of black swans for materialism. So materialism just doesn't work, logically or empirically. Of all the options we have available on the table today, materialism is the worst. It's the one we can discard with the most confidence as not plausible, as not tenable. We have to look for alternatives. The world is not physical. It is not material. It is material only in the colloquial sense, in the sense that there are colloquially material things around us, but they are not quantitative in essence. They must be qualitative in essence, because qualities is all we really know by direct acquaintance. Qualities are nature's given. They precede theory. Qualities are what we have before we begin abstracting and theorizing. So what is this qualitative world? How can we make sense of the fact that we seem to inhabit the same world? That's what I'm going to talk about now. That's the philosophy of analytic idealism, which I argue for. Let's start from the beginning. There is an objective world out there beyond our individual minds. That is self-evident. If you were where I am right now, you would describe the building where I am in a way very consistent with my own description of it. So clearly, we inhabit a world that is beyond us, that is beyond our individual minds. But the fact that it is outside our individual minds does not mean that it is non-mental. The thoughts of another person are outside your individual mind, but they are mental. The emotions of your neighbor are outside your individual mind, but they are mental. That there are mental processes beyond our individual minds is also a very intuitive and, I would say, established fact. So there is no counterintuitiveness, no contradiction in the hypothesis that there can be mental stuff beyond your individual mind. And the world is beyond our individual minds. So it might as well be mental stuff. That's the position of analytic idealism. The world, the universe, what exists is mental, but not your mentation, not my mentation alone, not even the mentations of all living beings put together. It's made of transpersonal mental processes out there, which present themselves to us upon observation as what we colloquially call matter. And matter is therefore a representation on our internal dashboard. We are pilots flying by instruments throughout life. The physical world is what shows up on the dials of the dashboard. But the world that is measured by the airplane's sensors, in other words, by our retinas, our eardrums, the surface of the tongue, the lining of the nose, and even the outer layer of the skin, the stuff that is measured by our sense organs is not physical. What is measured is transpersonal mental processes. And upon measurement, those transpersonal mental processes out there are represented to ourselves on our dashboard as we call the physical world around us. Physical in the colloquial sense, not the strict philosophical sense. That's the idea. Now, how do we make sense of the fact that if everything is mental, if the entire universe, the whole of existence is mental, why do I not have access to everything? Why don't I know what your thoughts are? Why don't I know what is going on in China or the galaxy of Andromeda? Because I am a mental being as well. If the world is mental and I am mental, why can't I have a much more direct, intimate communication with all there is instead of being cooped up in my own individual mind? How can that be? And what is the relationship between our bodies, our brains, and our minds? Because they are very, very intimately correlated. We know that empirically. Now, there is a phenomenon, a well-known condition in psychiatry called dissociation. That's something we have known of for a couple of centuries, but since the turn of the 21st century, we know a lot more about it, thanks to the advent of neuroimaging. We know that people who suffer from an extreme form of dissociation called the dissociative identity disorder, or DID, we know that the patterns of their brain activity differs from a group of control subjects. So DID can even be diagnosed objectively. We know that dissociation can be so strong that it can literally render you blind to what is right in front of your eyes. As a matter of fact, this is exactly the result of research done in Germany in 2015. A woman suffering from a severe form of DID had multiple subpersonalities, which in psychiatry are called alters. Each alter of a person is a sort of a sub-personality with its own memories, its own personality traits, identifies differently from the other alters, go by different names. And in people, that's usually a reaction to trauma, when the mind of the person cannot bear the weight of the traumatic experience. It fragments itself into multiple disjoint centers of awareness. And this woman in Germany had multiple alters, some of which claimed to be blind, even though the woman herself was not blind. The host personality was not blind. Her eyes worked just fine, the optical nerve, the visual cortex, they were in fine order. So neuroscientists had this great idea to instrument this woman with an EEG cap to measure brain activity. And lo and behold, when a blind alter had executive control of the body, brain activity in the visual cortex at the back of the brain disappeared, even though the woman's eyes were open and she was perfectly sight capable. Now, this is not something one can fake. And when a sighted alter, or the host personality, was back in executive control, brain activity in the visual cortex came back to normal. So we know dissociation happens. We know that dissociation fragments one mind into multiple disjoint centers of awareness that often don't even know about each other's existence. And we know that it can literally make you blind to what is right in front of your eyes, let alone to somebody else's thoughts, let alone to what's happening in China or in the galaxy of Andromeda. So under analytic idealism, the mind of nature, a subjective field or a field of subjectivity that spans all of the universe, undergoes something akin to dissociation. And we are the alters of nature. We are the alters of the universe. Every living being is an alter of the universe. And that's why we can't read each other's thoughts. That's why we don't know what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda, because we are blinded by dissociation, just like that woman in Germany was blinded by dissociation to what was right in front of her open eyes. Now, as I mentioned before, we can even diagnose dissociation under functional brain scan. This was research done by Jolanda Schlumpf in the Netherlands in 2014. There is something dissociative processes look like. They have an extrinsic appearance. They look like something identifiable. So my postulate is that what we call biology, what we call life, metabolism, is what dissociation in the mind of nature looks like. We don't need a brain scanner to see the dissociative processes in the mind of nature, because we are in the mind of nature. We don't need to see through the skull. We are inserted. We are parts of the mind of nature. So if you look around to identify an image on the dashboard that correlates with dissociation, in other words, that is what dissociation looks like when represented on our dashboard, that image is life. That's what life is. Life is what a dissociative process in the field of subjectivity that underlies our nature looks like. And that is why your brain activity correlates with your inner experience. Because brain activity is what your inner experience looks like when observed from across a dissociative boundary. Brain activity is the image of the phenomenon, not the generator of the phenomenon. And of course, the image correlates very well, most of the times, with the phenomenon it is an image of. And that's why brain activity and inner experience go hand in hand most of the times. Because what the phenomenon looks like correlates with the phenomenon. There's no surprise here. Now notice that in the case of an image, the image doesn't need to be complete. In other words, the image of the phenomenon does not need to tell you everything there is to tell about the phenomenon, but a cause does. If a phenomenon has a certain cause, then you should be able to construe and derive everything about the phenomenon from its cause. So if brain activity is the cause of experience, then there cannot be anything to experience that you can't trace back to brain activity. But if brain activity is what experience looks like from across a dissociative boundary, then that image does not need to be complete. It does not need to have everything there is to say about the phenomenon it is an image of. For instance, and this is trivial, if you look at a person, you see a body. A body is the image of the person. But it doesn't tell you everything there is to say about the person. It doesn't tell you what's going on underneath the skin. It doesn't tell you what's going on the back of the person if you're looking at the person head on. There are a great many things that are not told about the person by the person's image. In other words, the person's body. And that's why sometimes, like psychedelic experience, like in the choking game, or G-force-induced loss of consciousness, or trance, and so on and so forth, brain activity does not correlate with experience. I would go further, and I would say that brain activity, our body in general, because it is the image of the alter when represented on a dashboard, it is also a representation of the dissociative process itself, not only the contents within the dissociation. When you have an alter, that alter has certain memories, certain experiences, which you could describe as the contents of the alter. But what defines the alter as an alter is its dissociative boundary, which is also a process. And as a process, it should also look like something. There should be something that dissociation itself looks like, not only the contents of the dissociation. And that should be part of what we call brain activity. Some brain activity must be what the dissociative process itself looks like. And if psychedelics and the choking game and G-force-induced loss of consciousness and so on and so forth, if by impairing brain activity, they are in fact impairing the dissociation itself, the dissociative boundary, rendering the dissociative boundary more porous, more permeable, then you would expect there to be more experiences. Because less dissociation means, by definition, more experiences. When that woman in Germany was blinded because of dissociation, upon that blind alter fading and the host personality reassuming control, the woman could see more experiences which correlate with a reduction of dissociation. So I would submit to you that most of the times, experience correlates with brain activity because one is what the other looks like. Not because one is the cause of, not because brain activity is the cause of experience, but because brain activity is what experience looks like. So more experience, more brain activity. Most of the times. But some impairments of brain activity are impairments of the dissociation itself. They render the dissociative boundary more porous. And then you will get less brain activity, less dissociation, and more experience. And I submit to you that's what happens in the psychedelic experience, under G-force-induced loss of consciousness, under anoxia or reduction of blood flow or oxygenation to the brain. That's what happens when people hyperventilate. There are even therapies that use hyperventilation for psychological integration, because hyperventilation increases the amount of oxygen in the blood too much, turns the blood alkaline, which is harmful to brain cells. So the brain capillaries, they shrink, and you get less blood flow to the brain, and that's why you can pass out if you hyperventilate. And people have learned, therapists have learned, that that has curative effects. Why? Well, because it's reducing dissociation in our individual minds. And that's what life is. Life is what dissociation looks like, and death is the end of life, or the end of dissociation. It's a reintegration of our inner experience, our inner being, into this spatially unbound field of subjectivity that underlies all of existence. Okay, how sure can I be of this? If I speak to you from a conceptual, analytic perspective, one can never be sure of anything except that there is experience. That's nature's sole given. Everything else entails some form of theorizing. But I submit to you that the important question is not what we can know for sure. The important question is, what do we have reasons to take seriously as a hypothesis? Let me give you an example. I do not know for sure that there is no flying spaghetti monster operating in a higher dimension and moving the planets around the sun using his invisible noodly appendages, because the empirical evidence is consistent with this hypothesis. The planets do go around the sun. And we postulate gravity or a curvature of space-time to account for that, but maybe it is the hyperdimensional flying spaghetti monster. I cannot categorically refute that. But that's not the important question. The important question is, do we have good reasons to believe that the flying spaghetti monster exists in a higher dimension? None whatsoever. We just don't have good reasons to believe that. In the same spirit, I don't think we have good reasons to take materialism seriously. And I do think we have very good reasons to take idealism seriously. It's not a matter of certainty. Look, we are monkeys running around a rock, going around the universe at a very high speed. We have had an intellect for about 30 to 50,000 years. Yesterday, the blink of an eye ago, in a planet that has existed for 4.5 billion years. How can we be sure of anything at all? We are monkeys. We can't be sure. The only game we can play is what is the best hypothesis we have, and what hypothesis can be confidently disregarded, for we have no reasons to take them seriously. Well, amongst those, I would include the flying spaghetti monster and materialism, and amongst the hypotheses that make sense, that survive a logical analysis because they are internally consistent, that survive an empirical analysis because they can accommodate all the evidence and make sense of the evidence. Amongst those hypotheses are the variations of idealism. And of course, I particularly like analytic idealism. It's the hypothesis that I think is most plausible, most explanatorily powerful. Am I sure about it? No, I'm a monkey. I can't be sure about it. But I live as though analytic idealism is true, because it's the best hypothesis I can come up with when I contemplate all the evidence and apply logic rigorously. People who think analytic idealism is implausible, often they operate under hidden materialist assumptions. For instance, they will say, how can mind be primary if when I prick my arm with a needle, which is a material event, I feel the pain? If I drink a beer, which is a physical liquid full of alcohol, my consciousness changes, my experience changes. So these are instances, they say, of physical causes having a mental effect. So physicality must precede mentation. Mentation must be a sort of a byproduct or an epiphenomenon or a consequence of physical processes, they say. And this may sound very intuitive to anybody who is making hidden physicalist assumptions, because you see, under idealism, the needle that pricks your arm is not a physical event. It is a mental event that is represented on the dashboard as a needle pricking your arm. That glass of alcohol is what a certain transpersonal mental process out there looks like. And when you ingest that alcohol, you're bringing an outside mental process inside the boundaries of your altar. And mental processes have effects on one another. That's trivial. If you think bad thoughts, you have bad emotions. If you're worried, your thoughts will be influenced by your emotions. Thoughts and emotions influence one another all the time. for exactly the same reason, that glass of alcohol influences your experience. And that needle pricking your arm leads to an experience. But the needle is not essentially physical. The alcohol is not essentially physical, because nothing is essentially physical under analytic idealism. The needle and the alcohol or the pill that you ingest, those two are representations on our dashboard of dials of mental processes out there. And mental processes do have causal effects on one another. Another criticism that I often hear is it has to do with the hypothesis of life being what alters look like, dissociative alters. And people will say, I can shake hands with somebody else, I can hit someone else over the head, but one alter cannot shake hands with another alter. One alter cannot hit another alter over the head. Well, is that actually true? Let's look at the research. To make a proper comparison, we have to look at the dream life of patients with DID, dissociative identity disorder. Because if analytic idealism is correct, then we are all inside a mind, and there is nothing outside that mind. So to compare it properly to a patient with DID, we have to compare it to what happens in the mind of the patient with DID. So let's look at the dream life of patients with DID. Harvard did research on that, Deidre Barrett, many years ago. And it turns out that 1/4 of patients with DID report, maybe more have those dreams, but 1/4 report dreams in which the different alters partake in the same dream. And they can see the other alters as different characters in the same dream. And lo and behold, yes, they can club one another over the head. Then there are dream reports containing exactly that kind of event. And after the dream, when the host personality wakes up and talks to a therapist, each alter reports the same dream to the therapist, but the same dream experienced from the alter's own unique perspective. And they report seeing the other alters and interacting with the other alters, talking to, shaking hands, and clubbing one another over the head. So the analogy with dissociation survives further than people tend to think at first. This may be the dream of the natural mind, and we are alters in the dream of natural mind, shaking hands, talking, and clubbing each other over the head.